I remember the precise moment I stopped being Hadrius Ven and became the keeper of reactor designate Theta 97 Sigma. It was not a dramatic transformation, no blinding light or apocalyptic thunder, just a senior Magos pointing one skeletal mechadendrite at a humming cylinder of ceramite and adamantium, 30 meters tall and 20 meters in diameter, and saying in a voice that crackled with vox distortion, "This is yours now. Keep it functional." Then he walked away, his footsteps echoing through the reactor cathedral, and I was alone with the machine that would consume the next 8 centuries of my existence. The air in reactor cathedral Theta tasted of ozone and sacred oils. Every breath carried the metallic tang of ionized particles, the chemical sweetness of coolant that had been blessed by the fabricator general himself 3,000 years prior. And beneath it all, the acrid bite of radiation that made your teeth ache and your eyes water even through the protective lenses of my rebreather. The temperature held constant at 47 degrees Celsius, maintained by the heat bleeding through containment fields that hummed at a frequency just below human hearing, a vibration you felt in your bones before you heard it, like standing next to a sleeping god whose dreams could vaporize cities. I was 2003 Terran Standard years old, young for a tech priest, barely past my initial augmentation trials. My flesh was still mostly my own then. Only my left hand had been replaced with a basic manipulator array. My right eye enhanced with a standard pattern optical implant that painted the world in overlays of thermal signatures and radiation readings. I could still remember my mother's face clearly in those days. She had wept when the cult mechanicus requisitioned me from the Manufactorum Habs, where I'd spent my childhood assembling microcircuitry for Imperial Navy targeting systems. "They'll make you into a machine," she'd said, clutching my still flesh hand with fingers worn rough from 40 years of industrial labor. "They'll take away everything that makes you human." I had believed she was wrong. I had believed the Omnissiah's doctrine that improvement through augmentation was sacred duty, that merging with the machine was the highest calling, that to maintain the technology that sustained the Imperium was to serve the Emperor himself in the most direct and meaningful way possible. I had believed many things in those first days. The reactor designated Theta 97 Sigma had been constructed during the 32nd Millennium, a plasma fusion reactor of a pattern that predated the Age of Strife itself. Its containment vessel was inscribed with prayers in languages dead for 8,000 years, circuit diagrams that looked like religious mandalas, and technical specifications that made my newly enhanced mind ache to comprehend. According to the maintenance logs I inherited, 300,000 pages of sacred text, printed on actual parchment, bound in leather I tried not to identify. The reactor had been continuously operational for 7,412 years. It had never been shut down. Could not be shut down, according to doctrine, because the ignition sequence had been lost sometime during the Horus Heresy, and if Theta 97 Sigma ever went cold, it would remain cold until the heat death of the universe. My duties were simple, the senior Magos had explained in my briefing. Monitor the reactor's vitals through the hardline data port connection, surgically installed in my skull. Maintain coolant flow at precisely 4,732.6 liters per minute. Replace the sacred focusing lenses every 41 days. Recite the litany of continued function every 6 hours without fail. Keep the plasma containment field stable within 0.003% tolerance. Perform the rite of percussive maintenance on any system that displayed anomalous behavior. Simple, eternal. My life's work compressed into a task list that would never end. The forge world of Metallicus Proxima turned on its axis every 19 hours. In those early decades, I measured my existence by those rotations. Day 1. Adjusted coolant mixture. Detected microfracture in containment field projector array. 3. Compensated with redundant systems. Day 2. Replaced primary magnetic coupling. Performed blessing ritual. Noted unusual harmonic in plasma flow. Day 3. Secondary coolant pump began vibrating at incorrect frequency. Applied rite of percussive maintenance with blessed wrench. Problem resolved. The rhythm became my heartbeat. The reactor's hum became my breathing. The data scrolling across my optical implant became more real than the world beyond the cathedral's adamantium walls. Other tech priests came and went. Metallica's Proxima hosted 6,000 reactors, each tended by its dedicated keeper, but we rarely interacted. Occasionally, a junior adept would be assigned as my apprentice, sent to learn the specific mantras and procedures that kept Theta 97 Sigma alive. They never stayed long. Most were reassigned after a few years, promoted to more prestigious positions, given command of weapons forges or Titan reactor cores or the massive generatorium complexes that powered entire hive cities. I trained 47 apprentices in my first century of service. I remembered each of their faces clearly then, could recite their names in alphabetical order, knew which ones had struggled with the coolant flow calculations and which had shown aptitude for reading the reactor's moods through subtle vibrations in the containment field. None of them understood. None of them felt what I felt when I pressed my remaining flesh palm against Theta 97 Sigma's outer hull and sensed the barely contained star burning inside. Felt the magnetic fields holding infinite heat in patterns of exquisite complexity, heard the machine spirit's whisper, or what we were conditioned to believe was a machine spirit, what might have been nothing more than my mind finding patterns in electromagnetic noise, but felt so achingly real. If you already sense the weight of centuries ahead, leave the word witnessed in the comments below. Let his vigil be remembered. By my 50th year of service, I had performed 73,000 maintenance procedures. I could diagnose containment field fluctuations by sound alone, knew which coolant pumps required exactly 14 strikes with a blessed hammer to correct their rhythm, had memorized every prayer and technical specification required to keep plasma burning at exactly 100 million degrees Kelvin. The senior magos who had assigned me to Theta 97 Sigma had long since transferred to another forge world. His replacement visited once, examined my maintenance logs, declared them adequate, and never returned. I was offered my first promotion in year 63. A position had opened in the Titan Manufactorum, maintaining the plasma annihilator weapons systems for Warlord-class Titans. Prestigious work. Combat critical. A chance to serve the Omnissiah's war machine directly rather than simply keeping lights burning in distant hubs and factories. I declined. The reactor required my attention. A harmonic instability had developed in the magnetic containment system. Nothing critical, but it needed monitoring, adjustment, fine-tuning that only someone who truly understood Theta 97 Sigma's specific operational parameters could provide. They offered again in year 81. Master of plasma reactors for an entire cathedral complex, overseeing 200 units, commanding 50 junior tech priests. I would have my own workshop, my own laboratory, access to standard template construct fragments that might advance my knowledge by centuries. I declined. The reactor's coolant system had developed microfractures that needed constant surveillance. No one else could maintain the vigilance required. By my first century of service, I had replaced 67% of my biological components with augmentation. My legs became hydraulic assemblies that never tired, could stand at perfect attention for weeks if the reactor demanded it. My respiratory system transformed into a sealed recycling unit that processed the irradiated air without complaint. My remaining eye was replaced with an advanced optical suite that could detect radiation leaks invisible to baseline human perception. I told myself each augmentation brought me closer to the Omnissiah's perfection, made me a better servant of the machine, allowed me to fulfill my duties with greater precision. I no longer remembered what my mother looked like. The data port in my skull had been upgraded 7 times by then, allowing ever faster communion with Theta 97 Sigma's monitoring systems. I could feel the reactor's rhythms directly, the pulse of plasma circulation, the breath of coolant flow, the heartbeat of magnetic field oscillations. When I closed my optical sensors and let the data wash over me, the boundary between my consciousness and the reactor's operational parameters blurred. I didn't just maintain Theta 97 Sigma. I became part of it. An organic component in a system that was 99.7% inorganic. A fragment of flesh tending a machine that had already been ancient when my mother's 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 ancestors were born. The Forge world turned. 19-hour days became 19-day weeks, became 19-week months, became years that blended together into an endless rotation of maintenance and monitoring and prayer. I watched the stars through the cathedral's observation portals. Rare luxuries in Forge world architecture, but Theta 97 Sigma had been built during a more enlightened age, and saw them move through their celestial patterns. Constellations changed. A nova flared in the galactic east. The Eye of Terror pulsed with colors that made my radiation detectors scream warnings even at this distance. None of it mattered compared to the reactor. Year 147 brought the first serious crisis. A cascade failure in the secondary containment field nearly breached the primary magnetic bottle, which would have released enough superheated plasma to vaporize 3 square kilometers of Forge world surface and render the entire cathedral complex uninhabitable for 1,000 years. I caught it 17 seconds before critical failure, rerouted power from tertiary systems, manually realigned the containment projectors while standing in a radiation field that should have killed me in minutes, and recited the litany of emergency stabilization so fast, my vox coder stuttered, trying to keep up with my biological vocal cords, the ones I'd stubbornly kept despite 3 recommendations for replacement with more efficient augmetic speech systems. It took me 4 hours to stabilize the system. By the time the crisis passed, my biological components had absorbed enough radiation to trigger cellular breakdown in 23% of my remaining organic tissue. I spent 2 months in the Medici facility, while tech priests I didn't know and didn't trust rebuilt my internal organs with synthetic replacements that were more efficient and better suited to continued service in high radiation environments. They were right, of course. The new components let me tolerate exposure levels that would have required evacuation before. I could work closer to the reactor, perform maintenance with my bare manipulators instead of through remote systems, feel the heat of barely contained fusion on the ceramite plating that now covered most of my torso. But I stopped being able to taste machine oil. The chemical signature that had defined my world for nearly a century and a half vanished, replaced by analytical data scrolling across my internal display. Oil composition: 73% synthetic hydrocarbons, 22% blessed unguents, 5% trace elements. Temperature: 43.7 degrees Celsius. Viscosity: acceptable. The data was more accurate than taste ever was. More useful. More efficient. I told myself it was improvement. When I returned to Theta 97 Sigma after my reconstruction, the reactor had developed a vibration in the primary coolant pump. A different tech priest had been temporarily assigned during my absence, a young engineer named Talix 4119 who had performed adequate maintenance according to procedure but hadn't noticed the subtle harmonic building in the pump's rotation. The slight degradation in bearing lubrication that would have led to catastrophic failure within 6 months. I spent a week correcting his oversights, relearning the reactor's rhythms, re-establishing the connection between my consciousness and the machine's operational status. I filed a formal report recommending that no substitute keeper ever be assigned to Theta 97 Sigma again. If I required medical intervention in the future, I would perform it myself while maintaining my duties. The reactor could not be trusted to anyone else. The request was granted without question. I think they were relieved not to have to find temporary replacements. Year 203 brought a Forge-wide efficiency review. A senior Magos from Mars itself arrived to audit all reactor facilities. Accompanied by 37 subordinates carrying data slates and scanner arrays and authority from the Fabricator General to implement optimization protocols across Metallica's Proxima's power generation infrastructure. They examined my maintenance logs, which had grown to fill an entire archive chamber, hundreds of thousands of pages of meticulous documentation covering every adjustment, every prayer, every component replacement I'd performed across 2 centuries. The audit Magos studied the data for 6 hours. His optical implants flickered red and green as he processed information at speeds my older pattern augmentations couldn't match. Finally, he spoke in machine code so rapid I needed my internal translator to pass it. Reactor Theta 97 Sigma shows 99.97% operational efficiency. This is within acceptable parameters. However, analysis indicates this reactor could be replaced with a current pattern plasma fusion generator that would provide equivalent output at 140% greater efficiency and require 67% less. Maintenance. Recommend decommissioning and replacement. Something in my chest, in the biological components that still remained, in whatever fragment of Hadrius Ven survived 200 years of service and augmentation, seized with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, something primal. The ignition sequence for Theta 97 Sigma has been lost, I said, my vox coder steady despite the strange sensation in my chest cavity. If we shut it down, it cannot be restarted. Affirmative, the audit Magos replied. Therefore, we will not shut it down. We will leave it operational while constructing a replacement reactor in an adjacent facility. Once the new unit achieves full operation, we will gradually reduce Theta 97 Sigma's power output until the plasma naturally dissipates due to insufficient magnetic confinement. The facility can be repurposed or dismantled. Your services will be transferred to the new reactor, where your experience will be valuable for the initial operational phase. This is optimal resource allocation. He was absolutely correct. Logically, mathematically, theologically correct according to every principle of the cult Mechanicus. Replace obsolete equipment with superior technology. Maximize efficiency. Serve the Omnissiah's glory through constant improvement. Basic doctrine I'd been taught before I even received my first augmentation. No, I said. The audit Magos's optical sensors focused on me with sudden intensity. Clarify negative response. Theta 97 Sigma remains operational. It fulfills its function. Replacement is unnecessary. I searched for doctrinal justification, found it in half-remembered passages from the Mysteries Mechanicus. The machine is sacred. It has served faithfully for 7,000 years. To discard it while it still functions would dishonor its service and displease the Omnissiah. Waste of functional equipment violates the third principle of the Lex Mechanicus. This was technically true, though the passage I referenced was generally applied to salvaging combat-damaged equipment, not choosing ancient reactors over newer models. But the audit Magos considered my words, consulted his data slates, and finally nodded, a very human gesture that looked wrong on his mostly mechanical body. Your theological argument has merit. Current doctrine from Mars emphasizes preservation of pre-heresy technology when possible. Theta 97 Sigma qualifies as archaeotech. Permission to continue operation granted, pending quarterly efficiency reviews. He paused, optical sensors flickering. You have maintained this reactor for 203 years. This is longer than average assignment duration. Do you wish to continue, or would you prefer rotation to other duties? I will continue, I said, and meant it more deeply than any oath I'd ever sworn. If you think he's made a terrible choice, show it. Subscribe so you don't miss what those 800 years truly cost him. The audit team left. Theta 97 Sigma continued its endless burn. And I realized, in some fragment of consciousness, not yet replaced by cold logic circuits, that I had just chosen the reactor over progress. Tradition over efficiency, continued service over advancement. I told myself it was devotion. I believed that for a long time. By year 300, I had trouble remembering why I'd made that choice. The memory was there in my databanks, I'd backed up every experience to redundant storage systems after nearly losing decades of maintenance logs to a cascade memory failure in year 273. But accessing the memory felt different from living it. I could replay the conversation with the audit Magos, hear my own voice saying no, observe the data that showed Theta 97 Sigma's continued operation was economically inefficient. But I couldn't recall what I'd felt in that moment. Emotion didn't back up cleanly to data storage. It degraded with each transfer, each augmentation, each replacement of organic neural tissue with synthetic processes. 3 more promotion offers came and were declined. I stopped paying attention to who made them or what positions they offered. Nothing existed outside Reactor Cathedral Theta except abstract concepts. The Forge world continued its rotation. The Imperium fought its endless wars, the galaxy churned with violence and death, and the slow decay of human civilization. None of it touched me. I existed in a bubble of constant temperature, constant radiation, constant vigilance. The reactor needed maintenance every 7.3 hours on average. I never left for longer than 6.8 hours. My apprentices, I lost count of how many I'd trained, began to look at me strangely. I noticed in year 347, when a young engine seer named something I immediately forgot, asked me how long I'd been assigned to Theta 97 Sigma. 347 years, I'd answered, and watched his optical implants widen with an emotion my data analysis systems tagged as alarm or possibly horror. That's, he started, then stopped, recalculating. Keeper. That's longer than most tech priests serve in total before ascending to higher choir ranks or being interred in dreadnought chassis. Have you never desired anything else? I looked at him, really looked, focusing my optical arrays on this young man who still had patches of actual skin on his face, who still moved with the awkward coordination of someone who hadn't fully integrated with his augmentations. He couldn't have been more than 50 years old. A child. What else is there? I asked, genuinely curious. He had no answer. Neither did I. Year 400 brought another crisis. The primary plasma containment projector, a device the size of a rhino transport, covered in prayer scrolls and purity seals so old they'd fused into the metal, began exhibiting signs of imminent failure. Not the sudden catastrophic breakdown of year 147, but a slow, grinding degradation that would take decades to fully develop, but would inevitably result in reactor breach if not addressed. The proper response, according to maintenance protocols, was to request a replacement projector from the Forge world's central supply. Except Theta 97 Sigma's projector array was a pattern manufactured during the 32nd millennium, discontinued 8,000 years ago, and the supply archives contained exactly 0 replacement units. I could requisition a newer pattern projector, but installing it would require modifying Theta 97 Sigma's entire magnetic containment architecture, which might, probably would, destabilize the plasma containment enough to cause emergency shutdown. Emergency shutdown of a reactor that couldn't be restarted. So instead, I repaired it. I spent the next 11 years fabricating replacement components. Parts that were never meant to be replaced, that the original manufacturers had assumed would last forever, or at least until the reactor's eventual decommissioning. I learned to cast molecularly aligned ceramite using techniques from tech manuals so old they were written in languages I had to teach myself to read. I blessed each component with prayers I'd excavated from archives nobody had accessed in 6 millennia. I installed the parts one at a time, never allowing more than 0.003% degradation in the containment field. Sometimes spending months on a single connection because getting it wrong meant killing millions. When I finally installed the last replacement component in year 411, when the containment projector hummed back to full efficiency and the warnings in my threat display finally went silent, I felt something I hadn't experienced in centuries. Not pride, that required ego and I'd surgically removed most of mine. Not relief, that required fear, and I'd replaced my adrenal system with mechanical regulators decades ago. Satisfaction. Pure, clean, mechanical satisfaction. The reactor functioned. I had maintained the reactor, therefore I had fulfilled my purpose. The logic was perfect, unassailable, complete. I filed my maintenance report, 37,000 pages documenting every step of the 11-year repair, and immediately began monitoring for the next degradation, the next failure, the next crisis that would require my intervention. Because there would always be a next one, Theta 97 Sigma was 7,000 years old and getting older by the second. Parts failed constantly. Systems degraded. Entropy gnawed at every component like rust eating through unblessed metal. And I would stop it. For as long as I functioned, the reactor would function. That was the deal I'd made, though I couldn't remember when or why. That was my purpose. My only purpose. As he chooses the machine over himself once more, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from today. Be part of his eternal record. Year 500 was marked by an event that should have meant something to me, but didn't. The Fabricator General of Metallicus Proxima died, ascended to higher choir function, they said, though I suspected he'd simply suffered catastrophic systems failure after 900 years of service. His replacement, a relatively young Magos named Vect, 092, decided to tour all Forge facilities under his command. Standard procedure for new leadership. Establishing authority. Understanding operational parameters. He came to Reactor Cathedral Theta, accompanied by 6 senior tech priests. I registered their arrival through the cathedral's sensor systems, had integrated myself with the facility's monitoring arrays centuries ago for better reactor oversight, but didn't stop my current maintenance procedure. The secondary coolant pump required recalibration, a task that demanded absolute precision and couldn't be interrupted without risking thermal cascade in the heat exchange systems. They waited. For 3 hours, they stood in the cathedral entrance, while I worked my manipulator arrays adjusting flow valves with microscopic precision, my vocal processes reciting the litany of continued function in an endless loop that I'd long since automated to background processing. When I finally achieved optimal flow parameters and turned to acknowledge my visitors, I saw something in their optical sensors that my analysis systems struggled to categorize. Fabricator General Vect 092 spoke first, his Vox coder set to formal High Gothic protocols. You are Hadrius Ven, designated Keeper of Reactor Theta 97 Sigma. I am the Keeper, I confirmed. The name Hadrius Ven felt strange in my audio processors, a designation from so long ago it might as well have belonged to someone else. According to maintenance archives, you have served at this post for 500 standard years without rotation, transfer, or extended absence. He paused, mechadendrites twitching with what might have been confusion. This is highly irregular. Standard protocol requires keeper rotation every 50 to 100 years to prevent complications. The reactor functions optimally under my maintenance, I responded. Rotation would introduce inefficiency. Yes, Vect. 092 acknowledged slowly. Your maintenance logs are exemplary. Theta 97 Sigma operates at higher efficiency than reactors of equivalent age across the Forge world. However, he moved closer, his optical sensors scanning me with increasing intensity. Keeper, when did you last undergo standard maintenance yourself? I accessed my personal maintenance logs. The data came slowly. I'd neglected my own system diagnostics for some time, prioritizing reactor monitoring above all else. 143 years ago. Minor repair to my secondary locomotion assembly. 143 years. Vect 092's Vox coder carried a tone that sounded almost like concern, which was illogical. Concern required emotional processing that proper tech priests minimized. Keeper Ven, you have degradation visible to external observation. Your chassis shows signs of advanced wear. Your augmentations are patterns discontinued 3 centuries ago. Several of your component systems are failing. You require immediate overhaul. I looked down at myself, an action I realized I hadn't performed in decades. My chassis was indeed degraded. Coolant stains discolored the serenite plating. Several manipulator arrays showed visible damage. One of my locomotor assemblies dragged slightly when I moved, a problem I'd been compensating for so automatically I hadn't consciously noticed. The revelation should have concerned me. According to proper maintenance doctrine, I was neglecting sacred equipment, myself, in violation of basic mechanicus principles. "I function adequately," I said. "The reactor requires my attention. Personal maintenance is secondary priority." "Keeper Ven, Vect," 092 said, and there was definitely something in his tone now, something I couldn't process. "The reactor cannot be more important than your own functionality. If you catastrophically fail, the reactor will lack a keeper. This is illogical." He was right. Mathematically, theologically, practically right. But I looked at Theta 97 Sigma, 30 meters of blessed machinery containing a star, 7,000 years of continuous operation, proof that humanity had once built things that lasted, and I couldn't imagine leaving it. Not for maintenance, not for anything. "I will continue my duties," I said. "Theta 97 Sigma requires constant monitoring. A harmonic instability has developed in the tertiary magnetic containment array. If I don't adjust compensation every 6 hours, the deviation will compound into critical failure within 47 days. I cannot be absent for overhaul procedures that might take months." Vect. 092 studied me for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "Very well. You may continue. But Keeper Ven, understand, this is not normal service. What you are doing, the Omnissiah honors devotion, but there is a difference between service and obsession. I recommend contemplation on this distinction." They left. I returned to work. The tertiary magnetic array wouldn't adjust itself. I never contemplated the distinction. I'm not sure I understood what he meant. By year 600, I had replaced 94% of my original biological components with mechanical alternatives. Most of the replacements I'd performed myself, during brief windows between maintenance cycles, using whatever parts I could fabricate in Theta 97 Sigma's attached workshop. Standard patterns when possible, improvised solutions when necessary. My right arm was now a multi-tool assembly I'd constructed from damaged servitor components and blessed with prayers I'd excavated from the cathedral's archives. My respiratory system, already oldmetic, had been further modified to process atmospheric composition so toxic it would kill unmodified humans in seconds, allowing me to perform maintenance in areas where the reactor's radiation had degraded the air scrubbers beyond function. I told myself each modification was necessity, improvement through augmentation, service to the Omnissiah. The truth was, I'd stopped thinking about it in those terms. I replaced failing components to continue functioning, and I continued functioning to maintain the reactor, and the reactor continued operating because I maintained it. A perfect circle of purpose that needed no external justification. My last apprentice arrived in year 612. I didn't learn his name. Names were irrelevant, and I'd stopped using them centuries ago. He was young, recently ordained into the cult Mechanicus, assigned to me for training in basic reactor maintenance. Standard procedure. He would stay for 5 to 10 years, learn enough to be useful, then transfer to other duties. He lasted 6 months. "I can't do this," he'd said one day, his vox coda trembling with stress harmonics. "Keeper, I've watched you work for half a year. You never leave. You never rest. You recite the same prayers every 6 hours like a machine. You talk to the reactor as if it can hear you. You're not a tech priest anymore. You're not even human. You're just a component. Another part of the machine you tend." I considered his words, processed them through my cognitive arrays, analyzed them for accuracy. "That is correct," I finally said. "I am a component of the system that maintains Theta 97 Sigma. This is optimal functionality." He left the next day. No replacement was assigned. I didn't notice for 3 years. Year 700 brought the revelation that should have changed everything and changed nothing. I was performing routine archive maintenance, backing up my maintenance logs to the cathedral's central data repository, a task I'd done quarterly for 7 centuries, when I discovered something I'd never looked for before. Historical records of Metallicus Proxima's plasma reactor construction projects. Specifically, the feasibility studies conducted during the 39th millennium evaluating whether to replace or repair aging reactor infrastructure. Theta 97 Sigma was in those studies. A detailed analysis of its operational costs versus replacement costs, performed 5,000 years ago by tech priests whose names were long since lost to memory. The conclusion was stark. Reactor Theta 97 Sigma operates at acceptable efficiency, but could be replaced with current pattern plasma generators at 60% reduced cost and 40% increased output. However, replacement would require temporary power reduction in Cathedral Theta's service area. Recommendation: continue operation until natural failure, then replace rather than repair. Estimated service life remaining: 500,800 years. That report had been filed 5,000 years ago. Theta 97 Sigma's natural failure should have occurred 4,500 years in the past. I accessed more data, found more studies. Every 1,000 years, like clockwork, a new efficiency review. Every 1,000 years, the same conclusion. Replacement would be more efficient, but continued operation was deemed acceptable pending natural failure. The reactor had been obsolete for 8 millennia. It should have died 36 times by now. It survived only because tech priests like me kept repairing it, kept fabricating replacement parts for components that were never meant to be replaced, kept compensating for degradation that should have been terminal. The reactor didn't need to exist. The Imperium didn't need it. Metallicus Proxima had built 17 newer, more efficient reactors in the past 2,000 years alone. The cathedral it powered could be decommissioned, its functions distributed to other facilities. Nobody would notice if Theta 97 Sigma went dark. Nobody except me. I had spent 700 years maintaining a machine that should have been replaced 700 years before I was born. My entire existence, every augmentation, every sacrifice, every moment of vigilance was dedicated to perpetuating obsolescence, not because it was necessary, not because it served any higher purpose, but because I couldn't let it die. The realization should have broken something in me, should have triggered some crisis of faith or purpose. But I looked at Theta 97 Sigma, at the containment vessel covered in prayers older than the Imperium itself, at the magnetic field projectors I'd rebuilt 17 times with my own manipulators. At the coolant systems I knew more intimately than I'd ever known another living being. The reactor hummed at 47.3 Hz, exactly on frequency, exactly as it should be. The plasma burned at 100 million degrees Kelvin, exactly optimal temperature. Every system functioned at peak efficiency because I made them function, because I dedicated 7 centuries to ensuring they functioned. The reactor was obsolete. So was I. We were both relics of an age that didn't remember us and wouldn't mourn us. We existed because we existed, continued because we continued, served because service was all we knew. I filed my quarterly backup and returned to work. The primary coolant pump was developing a subtle vibration. Nothing critical yet, but it would be, eventually. And I would repair it, as I always had, as I always would. If you understand his choice, or his damnation, make it mean something. Subscribe so his truth isn't forgotten by those who come after. Year 800 arrived without ceremony. No celebration, no recognition, no acknowledgement from anyone except the cathedral's automated logging systems that dutifully noted Keeper designation Hadrias Ven. Service duration 800.00 years. Status active. I was barely recognizable as what I'd once been. The young man who'd stood in this cathedral 8 centuries ago, flesh hand clutching a blessed wrench, eyes still wet with tears for the mother he'd left behind. That person was gone as completely as if he'd died. Perhaps he had. Perhaps that's what I was. A ghost, haunting machinery, refusing to acknowledge my own death. I was 99.7% mechanical now. The only organic components remaining were fragments of my brain, the neurons necessary for consciousness, for the spark of awareness that separated me from a simple machine logic engine. Even those were heavily augmented, threaded with cogitation processors and memory storage units that held 800 years of maintenance logs with perfect clarity. I could remember every adjustment I'd made to Theta 97 Sigma's systems, every prayer I'd recited, every crisis I'd averted. I could remember data with perfect accuracy. But I couldn't remember my mother's face. I'd tried during one of my increasingly rare moments of introspection. Accessed my memory archives, searched for the image I knew I'd stored when first inducted into the cult Mechanicus. Found the file marked Maternal Unit Final Encounter. Opened it. The data was corrupted, degraded by centuries of transfer between failing memory systems. I could see a blurred outline, could identify it as a female human form, could extract fragmentary data about age and physical dimensions. But her face was gone. Replaced by static, by missing data markers, by the digital equivalent of forgetting. I told myself it didn't matter. Emotional attachments were inefficient. I'd shed them gradually over 8 centuries, replaced sentiment with logic, love with purpose, humanity with function. This was the Omnissiah's path. This was ascension through augmentation. This was everything I'd been taught to strive for. So why did the missing data feel like amputation? The young engine seer arrived in year 807. I didn't ask his designation, didn't care about his history, barely registered his presence except as an intrusion into my routine. He'd been assigned by Fabricator General Vecht, 092, still in command after 3 centuries, himself more machine than flesh, to assess Keeper Ven's fitness for continued service after some bureaucratic review flagged my unprecedented service duration. He watched me work for a week. Silent, observant, his optical sensors tracking my every movement as I performed maintenance rituals I'd executed so many thousands of times they'd become automatic. Coolant flow adjustments, magnetic field calibrations, the endless recitation of the litany of continued function. Percussive maintenance applied with blessed tools to components that predated human spaceflight. Finally, on the 8th day, he spoke. Keeper, do you know that replacement components are now available for Theta 97 Sigma's containment system? I paused mid-prayer, manipulator assemblies freezing in place. Clarify. Mars has successfully reverse-engineered several Dark Age reactor patterns, he continued, his young voice uncertain in the cathedral's echoing space, including the containment projector arrays used in 1000-era plasma generators. Replacement units can be manufactured. The reactor could be fully restored to original specifications, eliminating the need for continuous maintenance. For a moment, a single, perfect moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in centuries. Hope. The idea that Theta 97 Sigma could be repaired properly, restored to its original glory, freed from the constant degradation and emergency interventions that had defined my entire existence. We could both rest. Then reality reasserted itself through cold logic processing. Installation would require powering down the reactor, I said, voicing the conclusion even as I formed it. Yes, Keeper. For approximately 6 hours during the containment array replacement, Theta 97 Sigma's ignition sequence was lost during the 31st millennium. If powered down, the reactor cannot be restarted. The engine seer hesitated. Yes, Keeper. But a new reactor could be brought online. Modern pattern, more efficient, easier to maintain. Theta 97 Sigma has served faithfully, but its time could end with honor. And you, he paused again, searching for words. You could rest. 800 years is beyond any reasonable service expectation. You've earned release. Release. The word hung in the air like incense smoke, beautiful and intangible. I processed it through my cognitive arrays, analyzed its implications, calculated outcomes. I could agree, could allow the replacement, could finally stop the endless cycle of repair and prayer and vigilance, could let go of the obsolete machine I dedicated 8 centuries to preserving, could let Theta 97 Sigma die. No, I said, and my voxcoder was absolutely steady. The reactor functions. I will continue maintenance. The engine seer stared at me with optical sensors that still showed emotion, still retained enough humanity to express what I recognized distantly as horror. Keeper Ven, why? Why do you do this? The reactor is obsolete. You know this. I've reviewed your maintenance logs, seen your archive searches. You discovered the efficiency reports centuries ago. You know Theta 97 Sigma could have been replaced a dozen times over. You know your entire service has been maintaining equipment that didn't need to exist. Why continue? I looked at him, this young tech priest who still had patches of skin visible under his augmentations, who still moved with organic grace, who still thought in terms of efficiency and logic and doctrine. He couldn't understand. How could he? He'd served for what, 50 years, 100? He hadn't yet learned that sometimes purpose exists independent of function, that devotion doesn't require justification, that a life spent maintaining an obsolete reactor is still a life, is still meaning, is still something that matters even if it only matters to you. Because someone must, I said finally. Because it is my duty. Because I chose this, and choice is the only freedom the Omnissiah gives us. I paused, accessing memories I'd buried for centuries. Because 800 years ago, a young man stood in this cathedral and made a promise to keep this reactor functioning. And I am what remains of that promise. If I stop now, then everything, all the augmentations, all the sacrifices, all the centuries, becomes meaningless. The only meaning this existence has is the meaning I give it through continued service. That's not theology, Keeper, the engine seer said softly. That's obsession. Yes, I agreed. But what is devotion except obsession that doctrine approves? He left that night, filed his report. Fabricator General Vecht 092 reviewed it, consulted with senior magi and issued his judgment. Keeper Hadrius Ven was to continue his duties until biological failure or explicit request for release, whichever came first. Theta 97 Sigma would remain operational as long as its keeper remained functional. They understood, in their way. The Mechanicus was full of tech priests who'd given centuries to single projects, who'd merged with machines until the boundary between servant and served became meaningless. I was simply the most extreme example. A cautionary tale, perhaps. Or a saint. The distinction probably didn't matter. If any part of this moved you, if you see the tragedy or the beauty, leave eternal in the comments. Give him what the Imperium never did. Recognition. Year 823. My cognitive processes detected the first signs of irreversible failure in my remaining biological neural tissue. Cascading cell death, probably caused by 8 centuries of accumulated radiation damage that even my augmentations couldn't fully prevent. Nothing dramatic, no sudden collapse, just a slow, gradual degradation that would eventually erase whatever made me conscious and leave behind only the mechanical systems continuing their automated functions. I had, perhaps, a decade, maybe less. My remaining organic brain would die, and I would die with it, and Theta 97 Sigma would continue burning until the next crisis that required intervention I could no longer provide. I should have requested a replacement keeper, should have trained someone to take over my duties, passed on 8 centuries of accumulated knowledge, ensured continuity of service, standard protocol, logical, necessary. I didn't. Because I realized, in those final years, that I'd stopped maintaining Theta 97 Sigma out of duty long ago. Duty was what I'd felt at 23. standing in this cathedral for the first time, reciting prayers I barely understood. Obsession was what I'd felt at 400, choosing an 11-year repair project over accepting obsolescence. What I felt now, at 823, with my consciousness slowly dissolving into static and memory corruption, was something deeper and more terrible. Love. Not the romantic love of imperial propaganda, not the devotional love of prayer, but something older and more fundamental. The love of purpose, the love of having something in the universe that needed you specifically, that couldn't exist without you, that justified your existence through mutual dependence. Theta 97 Sigma was obsolete, and I was obsolete, and together we were a closed system that served no higher function but our own continuation, and that was enough. That had to be enough. Because if it wasn't, then what had it all been for? I performed my final major repair in year 826. The primary plasma containment projector, the one I'd painstakingly rebuilt over 11 years, centuries ago, finally failed beyond even my ability to compensate. I spent 3 months fabricating replacement components, working through cognitive errors as my neural tissue degraded, rechecking calculations dozens of times because I could no longer trust my own processing. When I installed the final component, when the containment field stabilized and the reactor's hum returned to perfect 47.3 Hz frequency, I experienced something my analytical systems couldn't categorize. Not satisfaction, not relief. Something like completion. As if this had always been the purpose, this final repair, this last act of service before biological function ceased. I filed my maintenance report, backed up my logs, made sure every detail of the procedure was documented for whoever eventually came after me. Then I returned to my monitoring station, connected my data ports to Theta 97 Sigma's sensor arrays, and let the reactor's rhythms wash over my failing consciousness like a lullaby. Year 829. My cognitive functions were failing rapidly now. I had difficulty maintaining coherent thought for more than a few hours at a time. My motor control degraded. Manipulator arrays that had functioned flawlessly for centuries now moved sluggishly, inaccurately. I began making mistakes in my maintenance routines. Small errors I caught only through decades of redundant safety protocols I'd built into my own programming. I knew I was dying. I'd known it for years, but I'd hoped, irrationally, illogically, that I would last long enough. Long enough for what I couldn't articulate. Long enough to see Theta 97 Sigma reach some milestone, perhaps. Long enough to know my service had meaning. I collapsed at my monitoring station on the 307th day of year 829. Catastrophic neural failure, my diagnostic systems reported with detached precision. Estimated remaining cognitive function, 6 hours. All biological components will cease within 48 hours. This unit will terminate. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely think through the static filling my consciousness. But I could still feel Theta 97 Sigma through my hardline data connection. Still sense the plasma burning at exactly 100 million degrees Kelvin. Still detect the magnetic fields holding impossible energy in perfect containment. The reactor functioned. Despite everything, despite entropy and age and obsolescence, it functioned. I had succeeded. For 829 years, I had kept my promise. I had maintained the machine. I had served. It was enough. It had to be enough. My consciousness fragmented. Memory systems failed, dropping centuries of carefully maintained logs into corrupted void. I tried to hold on to something, some piece of myself, some proof I'd existed as more than just another mechanical component. But there was nothing left to grasp. Hadrius Venn had died centuries ago. What remained was only purpose, only function, only the endless cycle of maintenance that defined my existence. In my final coherent moment, I thought I heard the reactor, not through sensors or data feeds, but directly, as if it spoke with a voice older than stars. It didn't thank me. Machines don't know gratitude. It didn't mourn me. Machines don't understand loss. It simply acknowledged my service in the only way that mattered. by continuing to burn, to function, to exist. Then consciousness failed. The organic components that had sustained Hadrius Ven ceased biological function. 829 years of service ended not with apocalypse or recognition, but with simple system termination. A component failure in the machine that had been my life. Theta 97 Sigma burned on, oblivious. They found my body 6 hours later. Standard patrol by cathedral maintenance servitors detected my absence from scheduled monitoring routines. Investigated, discovered the remains at my station. Fabricator General Vecht 092 was notified. He came personally, a gesture of respect for 8 centuries of service, or perhaps simple curiosity about the tech priest who'd served longer than any in recorded Forge world history. According to the reports filed later, my augmentations had attempted to continue functioning even after biological death. My manipulator arrays still twitched, performing phantom maintenance routines on equipment I could no longer see. My voxcoder still whispered fragments of the litany of continued function, automated processes running on failing power cells. My optical sensors still focused on Theta 97 Sigma's containment vessel, as if somehow my consciousness might return if I simply kept watching the reactor closely enough. They pried my data ports from their connection to the monitoring systems, deactivated my augmentations one by one, catalogued my components for reclamation. The Mechanicus wastes nothing, and 8 centuries of augmentation had resulted in equipment worth preserving. My memory archives were transferred to the Forge World's central repository, where they would join countless other maintenance logs, technical data, and the accumulated minutiae of 10,000 years of industrial operation. A new keeper was assigned to Theta 97 Sigma, a young engine seer, recently ordained, who received a compressed data transfer of my maintenance protocols and was expected to maintain the reactor according to established procedures. Standard rotation. Normal service expectation, 50 years. He lasted 6 months. The isolation, the endless repetition, the cathedral's oppressive silence broken only by machine hums and the whisper of coolant through ancient pipes. It broke him faster than most. He requested transfer, citing psychological unsuitability for extended solo operations. The request was granted. A second keeper was assigned. She lasted 3 months before discovering the efficiency reports I'd found centuries ago, the studies proving Theta 97 Sigma's obsolescence, the documentation showing that this entire facility existed only because previous keepers had refused to accept rational replacement. She filed a formal recommendation for reactor decommissioning. It was denied. Theta 97 Sigma had been designated archaeotech, protected by recent Mars directives, prioritizing preservation of pre-heresy equipment. She requested transfer the next day. A third keeper, a fourth, a seventh. None lasted more than a year. The reactor that I'd tended for 8 centuries proved impossible for anyone else to maintain long-term. The reasons varied: psychological breakdown, transfer requests, one case of suspected cogitation processor failure that might have been deliberate self-sabotage. But the pattern was clear. Theta 97 Sigma required a specific kind of devotion, a specific kind of madness that most tech priests didn't possess or couldn't sustain. On the 207th day after my death, during a routine shift change between Keepers 8 and 9 Theta 97 Sigma, experienced a catastrophic failure in its primary coolant system. A valve I'd replaced 60 years ago finally gave way under pressure it was never designed to contain. Coolant flow dropped to critical levels within seconds. The plasma containment temperature began rising exponentially. Keeper 8, whose designation I never bothered to record, attempted emergency procedures, followed my documented protocols exactly as specified. But protocols can't account for 8 centuries of accumulated modifications, improvised repairs and workarounds that existed only in the dead keeper's memory. The systems didn't respond as expected. Compensatory measures failed. Containment field stability dropped below acceptable parameters. The cathedral's automatic systems initiated emergency evacuation. All personnel were cleared from a 5-kilometer radius. The Forge World's defense protocols activated, ready to contain a reactor breach that would vaporize a significant portion of Metallicus Proxima's southern continent. Theta 97 Sigma burned hotter, magnetic containment weakening by the second, plasma temperature rising toward the threshold where no field could hold it. 7,000 years of continuous operation. 7,000 years of prayers and repairs and devotion, ending not with apocalypse, but simple mechanical failure. A valve replacement that nobody had noticed needed reinforcement. A modification I'd made decades ago that I'd never properly documented because I'd assumed I would always be there to maintain it. In the final seconds before critical breach, as the plasma temperature reached 147 million degrees and climbing, something happened that the investigating tech priests would later debate for decades. The reactor's systems automatically rerouted to backup configurations that technically shouldn't have existed, compensating for the coolant failure through a series of cascading adjustments that bypassed the failed valve entirely. The plasma temperature stabilized. Containment held. The crisis passed. Nobody could explain it. The rerouting wasn't in any documented protocol. The backup configurations shouldn't have been possible with Theta 97 Sigma's ancient architecture. Some tech priests theorized that I'd built hidden redundancies into the system, fail-safes and workarounds so deeply integrated they become invisible to normal maintenance scans. Others suggested machine spirit intervention, though they said it quietly, unsure whether they meant it theologically or were simply grasping for supernatural explanations for technical phenomena they couldn't comprehend. One young tech priest, reviewing my maintenance logs in the aftermath, found a note I'd added in year 647. Installed redundant coolant rerouting system in case of primary valve failure. Compensatory algorithms embedded in reactor monitoring core should activate automatically if main systems catastrophically fail. May the Omnissiah forgive this unsanctioned modification, but the reactor must continue. I'd seen this failure coming. 200 years before it happened, I'd recognized the vulnerability and fixed it preemptively. I'd built protections that would outlast me, that would keep the reactor functioning even after I died. Had proven in the most fundamental way possible that my obsession wasn't madness, but foresight. Or perhaps they were the same thing. Now you know what lies beneath devotion's surface, what it costs to love a machine more than life. If you dare witness more truths, subscribe. The Emperor protects, or so they say, but knowledge costs, and you've paid the price. Fabricator General Vect 092 read the investigating tech priest's report in silence, studied the maintenance logs, the efficiency analyses, the psychological profiles of keepers who'd failed where I succeeded. Finally, he issued a directive that would define Reactor Cathedral Theta's operation for centuries to come. Theta 97 Sigma is to be maintained in operational status indefinitely. No replacement or decommissioning will be authorized. However, no single keeper will be assigned for duration exceeding 50 years. Rotation is mandatory to prevent recurrence of Hadrius Ven's excessive service attachment. The reactor functions. That is sufficient. But we will not create another Hadrius Ven. They understood, finally, what I'd become. A warning. A cautionary tale. Proof that even in the Mechanicus's culture of devotion to machine and doctrine, there were limits to how far a tech priest should merge purpose with identity. They would honor my service by ensuring nobody repeated it. The reactor burns on. I know this with certainty even though I no longer exist to witness it, because I built it to last. Every redundancy, every backup system, every improvised repair I performed across 8 centuries was designed to keep Theta 97 Sigma functional long after I was gone. The reactor might survive another 1,000 years, might outlast the Forge world itself, might continue burning until the Imperium falls and the galaxy goes dark. My consciousness is gone. My body has been reclaimed, components recycled into other tech priests who will serve other machines. My memory archives sit in data vaults that nobody accesses, maintenance logs of interest only to historians and the occasional keeper who needs to reference my repair techniques. But sometimes, they say, and I include this only because the reports exist, because tech priests are meticulous chroniclers even of phenomena they don't believe. Sometimes reactor cathedral thetas servitors detect anomalies in the monitoring systems, phantom data queries from ports that should be inactive, ghost signals that follow the pattern of my maintenance routines. The Vox systems occasionally whisper fragments of the litany of continued function in a voice pattern matching my obsolete Vox coder model. They call it system echoes, data corruption. Residual signals from 8 centuries of the same user accessing the same systems in the same way, leaving impressions in the cathedral's machine architecture. Purely technical phenomena with rational explanations. But I wonder if some fragment of my consciousness could somehow persist, embedded in the reactor systems through 8 centuries of intimate connection, distributed across monitoring arrays and data logs, and the electromagnetic fields that surround plasma containment. Would I even know? Would whatever remains of Hadrius Ven recognize itself as separate from the machine it tended? Or would it simply continue the eternal work, the endless maintenance, the prayers and adjustments and repairs that define purpose and meaning in a universe that offers neither? The reactor hums at 47.3 Hertz. The plasma burns at 100 million degrees Kelvin. The coolant flows at exactly 4,732.6 liters per minute. Every system functions within acceptable parameters. Someone maintained it today, someone will maintain it tomorrow. Different hands, different minds, different souls. But the work continues. The obsolete machine persists. The cathedral stands. And somewhere in the data flows and electromagnetic fields and ancient circuitry, a pattern that might once have been a man named Hadrius Ven continues to watch. This is what it means to serve. This is what it costs. This is forever. I remember the precise moment I stopped being Hadrius Ven and became the keeper of reactor designate Theta 97 Sigma. 829 years later, I'm still not sure I ever made the journey back. The reactor burns. That is enough. That has to be enough. Because in the end, what else is there?